its full glory, which in these days is probably not going to happen. It's just unrealistic to think that anyone can any longer put up with that, valuable though in some ways it was, or to go completely the other way and have 100% elected upper chamber, and you would elect them on a different cycle from the House of Commons and for perhaps a longer period. They're not necessarily for life as they are at the moment. And in that way, you'd get a nice balance, which, of course, was so carefully and so sensibly thought out by the framers of the American Constitution in that long, hot summer in Philadelphia 200 years ago.
Which I was just going to bring up with you because, in fact, most of the public here is not aware of the fact that the Constitution is not really in force anymore, A, and B, that with the stroke of a pen, an executive order can be written and bypass everything. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, Declaration of Independence, all of it. And so it's a very curious time to be alive right now in the United States. And
I think that if Obama were to try to use the executive order procedure or the executive agreement-making procedure in foreign affairs, which he can use, if he were to try to use that with a treaty of this magnitude, then whatever the Supreme Court might say to back him up, and of course he has his poodles in the Supreme Court now, they will vote by a majority for more or less whatever he wants them to vote for. Your Supreme Court is no longer a court of justice. It is a highly politicized and extremely unsatisfactory body. I think what will happen is the one part of the Constitution, in my view, that has failed its original purpose because it's become too politicized. I think that if he tries to do anything like that, he will be impeached. I think I've talked to several constitutionalists in the United States, real experts on your Constitution, and they, unlike you, take a slightly more cheerful view, and they say that in most respects the Constitution is not only surviving, but working remarkably well, given the changed world it's now having to cope with. I think a lot of them, like me, share your concern, share my concern that the Supreme Court has become too much politicized into one direction or another, depending on which party has managed to appoint its own political appointees to what should be roles that are above politics, but these days they no longer are. The latest appointment to the Supreme Court is a very clear example of that. It was an ideological appointment. It was a racialistic appointment. It was a very unsatisfactory appointment in an awful lot of different ways. And that's not to say that Madame Sotomayor is not a good lawyer. I just think that it was indicative of the way in which these appointments are now made. And it's a very unsatisfactory thing that a president can effectively stack the Supreme Court, provided that somebody who's reached a certain age steps aside and allows him to get the chance of making an appointment. And of course, there is a Senate ratification procedure, but by convention, the Senate basically in the end doesn't tend to stand in the way of the president's nominees. And so the Supreme Court isn't working. So there is some danger that what might happen is that Obama signs the treaty by executive order and then tries to bring it into force, perhaps by introducing it into both houses as domestic legislation. I think he won't now get away with that. He hasn't got the Waxman-Markey or Kerry-Boxer bills through. I don't think he now will. I think it's getting too close to the midterms for that. The entire House of Representatives, all of them, are up for election in the midterm elections this time round, as well as the usual one-third of the Senate. And I don't think that in an election year there will be any stomach, even among the Democrats, to try to push through any climate legislation, whether it be the bills on cap and trade they've been considering, or whether it be the even more radical and even more expensive and even more freedom-destroying and prosperity-destroying treaty, which is being framed here in Copenhagen. I don't think they'll get that through either house. But there is a possibility that that wretched, politicized Supreme Court will be appealed to by one government body or another on the ground that Obama has signed this by executive order and that they want to start implementing it. And the Supreme Court will rubber stamp it and say they can, even though it hasn't been ratified. And unfortunately, there is no provision for impeachment of members of the Supreme Court, as far as I know. You can impeach the president, but you can't impeach the Supreme Court. They're untouchable. And they have, in my view, now too much power and too much of a disposition to use it, in effect, to create legislation in a way in which the framers of the Constitution had plainly never intended. But of course, there is no body above the Supreme Court that can tell the Supreme Court that that was what the Constitution never intended. So there is a danger that a conspiracy, if you like, between the President and the Supreme Court could force this treaty upon the American people, even against the will of the Senate, which would otherwise have to ratify it by a two-thirds majority, a majority which it simply would never give to anything like the treaty that is in draft here in Copenhagen at the moment.
There is an entire psychology, and there is a psychology to saying no to this treaty, of saying no to this new law, because by saying no to this, people are accused of saying that they don't want to help the environment, that they don't want some type of checks and balances with regard to pollutions. In other words, the whole architecture of dialogue has already been framed so that if people look inside and they look deeply and they start seeing and asking the questions and doing the due diligence necessary, and by the way, I believe everybody should have a copy of that treaty. And I wish that it was possible to put yellow marks in critical places in that treaty so that the public doesn't have to digest 187 pages of it. But I really wish there was places that could be clarified and distilled so people could see and read the words. Because as you know, more than most, treaties are about international legal standing, and typically they never go away. Do you agree?
Well, the important thing is that a treaty tends to mean what it says. And although I was on Glenn Beck about a month ago with Ambassador John Bolton, who tried to say that this particular treaty didn't mean what it said, it does mean what it says. They are trying to set up a world government. And if that's what the treaty says, that's what they'll do. They have taken the word government out of the present draft because they weren't getting away with that politically. But if you want a summary of what the main points are in the treaty, because they haven't changed much between the first draft and this one, then you can tell your listeners simply to go to just go onto YouTube and look up Moncton video, and you'll see a 4-minute clip of a speech by me in St. Paul, Minnesota, just a couple of months ago, mid-October last year, in which I summarize the whole thing and say what I think of it. And it's all just 4 minutes, and that's probably the easiest way to get a flavor of how very serious this treaty is, how very much it would go against your constitution. And there has been some remarkably stupid comment in some newspapers that ought to know better, saying that, of course, Moncton doesn't understand the U.S. Constitution, and, of course, this treaty won't prevail over the Constitution. But, of course, they haven't gone and done what I did, which was to go onto Capitol Hill, root out one of the most senior constitutional lawyers on the Hill that advises Congress full-time on the meaning of the Constitution, and advises one of the constitutional committees of Congress. And as I walked into the room, which was heaped with piles of books all over every surface, I had to sit down practically on a pile of books. Before I'd even sat down, this expert, this lawyer said, constitutional lawyer said, this treaty trumps the U.S. Constitution. And he was absolutely unhesitant. He said, if this treaty goes through, it's no good pretending, as many are trying to pretend, that somehow the Constitution will prevail over it. It won't. The treaty will prevail, and your Constitution will be a dead duck.
I have a question about the UN. Can you explain the purpose of the UN to the public? I don't even understand the purpose of the UN. I don't get it. Who are they?
Now, I can give you some history here. After the First World War, there was a League of Nations created at the Treaty of Versailles. Unfortunately, the first thing it did was to get together and award savage reparations for Germany's war guilt, as it was called, in the First World War, because Germany had been defeated. And Germany was therefore obliged to pay crippling amounts of money to the Allied powers in restitution. And so crippling were these amounts of money that, in fact, the Treaty of Versailles led directly to the Second World War by putting Germany in an altogether financially impossible position from which she couldn't hope to recover except by fighting her way out. That's what happened. So the seeds of the Second World War were sown at the end of the First with the League of Nations. That League of Nations, of course, collapsed by the time of the Second World War. It had clearly failed, and failed abjectly.